I never imagined my life would turn upside down so swiftly. One day, I was sitting in my office discussing expansion strategies with my business partner, Trevor, and finalizing the next set of deals. The next day, my wife, Charlotte, packed her bags, left our home, and turned my world to rubble. I remember the day she told me she was in love with Trevor, how her voice trembled with some strange mix of excitement and shame. My heart pounded so hard in my chest, I worried I'd pass out. But I didn't. I stood there and let it tear me apart. There was a moment right before she walked out when I thought I'd beg. I'd heard stories of men in my position, men who pleaded, promised changes, and did whatever it took to keep a marriage intact. But the only words that passed my lips were shaky whispers of disbelief. All the while, she stared at me with what looked like pity. That hurt more than any accusation or insult. I wanted her to be furious or apologetic. Instead, she just looked at me like I was a bystander. She turned away, suitcases in hand, and left. I went through the usual stages of disbelief. First, I considered that maybe she was ill or depressed, or caught in some crisis that warped her perspective. I suppose I wanted a reason that would absolve both of us from blame. I spent hours analyzing every detail of our 10 years together, searching for clues I might have missed. Had Trevor always been lurking on the edges, waiting for a chance to snatch her away? Or had Charlotte come to a realization that our marriage was built on convenience rather than love? My head spun with possibilities. I felt utterly alone. In the weeks following her departure, I lost myself in the business. That ironically meant working closer with Trevor. I tried to hide my contempt behind professionalism, though every time I saw him, my stomach churned with betrayal. He acted as if nothing had changed, discussing budgets and marketing opportunities with the same fervor as always. Sometimes I'd catch a smugness in his smile, a spark in his eye that said he knew he'd won, but I refused to give him the satisfaction of seeing me crumble. If I was going to survive, I'd do it with dignity. Still, I endured. Late at night, I'd sit on the couch, flipping through the channels without really watching anything. My phone calls to Charlotte went unanswered. Once, she picked up by mistake, and all I heard was heavy breathing before she hung up. Rage gripped me, but so did a perverse longing. I still wanted her, despite everything. I hated myself for that. I hated how a single betrayal could define my self-worth. People would say, she's not worth it, but how do you simply erase a decade of shared life? My mind kept replaying the moment she confessed, taunting me, relentlessly. A few months passed without any real improvement. Then, in the middle of an investor meeting, Trevor announced he was leaving the company. He had found a new investment opportunity out of state. The moment he finished speaking, I felt a strange sense of relief. It was as if the man who had stolen my wife was granting me a reprieve. Maybe I could rebuild without his constant shadow. But my relief turned to curiosity. Why had Charlotte never told me of these plans? Was she going with him? I needed closure, but none was forthcoming. It haunted me daily. I considered contacting her family, but shame held me back. I didn't want to explain that my wife had run off with my partner, only to vanish from my life. Instead, I told people we had separated amicably, that we needed time apart. I wasn't ready for the pitying glances or the inevitable commentary about Trevor's betrayal. My parents offered to visit, but I lied, claiming I was too busy. In truth, I was embarrassed by my own emotional devastation. I'd lie awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying memories of better times, all while bitterness gathered inside me. It festered constantly. Then one day, months after Trevor's announcement, I received a call from him. His voice was uncharacteristically subdued. He wanted to discuss the dissolution of our partnership. I met him at a cafe, expecting arrogance or triumph. Instead, he looked drained, almost frightened. He told me he was leaving town, alone. Charlotte had chosen to remain behind, or so he said. She'd become clingy, he claimed, and he just couldn't handle the pressure anymore. He made it sound like a business decision. Cut losses, move on. My stomach roiled. Was my wife nothing more than a burden to him now? Incredible. I left the meeting with Trevor feeling strangely vindicated. So this man, who had once been my friend and business partner, had decided my wife was disposable after all. Anger coursed through me, not just at Trevor, but at Charlotte too. She had turned her back on me for someone who treated her like a passing fancy. Late that night, I found myself driving aimlessly through the city, letting the streetlights blur through my windshield. I wanted answers, closure, justice, maybe all three. When I finally parked outside my office building, I realized my hands were shaking on the wheel. Fury. The next morning, I discovered a voicemail on my phone from an unknown number. It was Charlotte, her voice cracking as she asked me to meet her at a motel on the outskirts of town. My gut reaction was a mix of dread and hope. I had imagined this moment countless times in my head, where she'd apologize, beg forgiveness, and we'd find a way forward, but the resentment I felt was profound. Still, I drove out there, heart pounding like a hammer. I found her sitting on a worn bedspread, eyes red from crying. She looked so small, so broken. I stood there, arms crossed, listening as she fumbled for words. She said Trevor had left her, claimed she was too needy, too emotional. She admitted she'd made a colossal mistake. Her tears soaked the sheets, and though part of me wanted to walk out, I also felt a tug of compassion I couldn't entirely ignore. I'd loved this woman for years. To watch her crumble now felt both infuriating and heartbreaking. She was asking if there was any chance, any possibility for us to start over. My mind screamed at me to be careful, to remember the pain. I asked her why she did it, why she betrayed me with Trevor. At first, she tried to blame it on dissatisfaction, how our marriage felt stagnant. She insisted she never stopped caring for me, but she craved excitement and got lured by Trevor's grand promises. She wept, sobbed that she realized too late how hollow those promises were. Part of me wanted to believe her. Another part whispered that she was only here because Trevor had thrown her away. Yet, when she clutched my hand, I felt that old protective instinct stir. I fought to keep it buried, tightly. We talked for hours, mostly her talking and me listening. She spoke of regrets, of nights she lay awake missing my steadiness. She described the hollow feeling that crept in once the initial thrill of the affair wore off. She lamented how Trevor treated her like an accessory, flaunting her in social settings, but dismissing her opinions. I sat there, silent, grappling with a storm of emotions: rage, pity, nostalgia. Her tears were real, but was her contrition genuine or just desperation? I recalled how swiftly she left me, how easily she shattered my trust. The wound still felt fresh, unhealed. When she finally fell asleep, I sat in the corner of that motel room, staring at her fragile form. Memories of our wedding day flooded me. How radiant she was, the way she looked at me like I was her entire world. Could we ever go back to that? Could any amount of remorse erase what she did? I thought about my own failings, the ways I might have taken her for granted, but nothing justified her betrayal. Yet there I was, unable to walk away. I hated my own weakness. Still, I pulled a blanket over her shivering shoulders. In the morning, we drove back to our old house. It felt surreal, unlocking that front door and stepping inside together. The walls still bore the paint colors we'd chosen as a couple, the photos we hadn't taken down. Dust motes danced in the sunlight, testament to my neglect. She walked through the rooms, shoulders hunched, as if expecting ghosts to leap out. We exchanged few words. I made coffee in the kitchen, the act so ordinary it felt like stepping back in time. But the air between us was heavy with betrayal, an invisible barrier I couldn't ignore. Tangible. Over the next weeks, Charlotte tried to help around the house, cooking meals and tidying up, as if these gestures might mend the gulf between us. She seemed contrite, genuinely remorseful, yet every time I looked at her, I remembered that she'd chosen Trevor over me. My bitterness lurked behind every conversation, every shared meal. She'd ask if I wanted to watch a movie together, and I'd force a polite shrug. I felt numb, caught between longing and resentment. We slept in separate rooms. Neither of us brought up the topic of our marriage directly, as though it might shatter us. In time, we talked, haltingly at first. She asked if I hated her. I told her I didn't know what I felt anymore. Hate, sorrow, regret, love, they all blended into something unrecognizable. She insisted she wanted to earn my trust back, that she'd do anything. I told her trust wasn't a faucet you could turn on. It would take more than promises and tears. She apologized for pushing me away before, for chasing a fantasy. I admitted I had my share of responsibility, that maybe I wasn't attentive enough, but neither of us knew if that would suffice, ever. I found myself confiding in a therapist, someone who knew nothing about me except my turmoil. I told him about the betrayal, the resentment, the fear of being hurt again. He told me healing doesn't necessarily mean returning to what was. Sometimes it means forging a new path, separately or together. I considered that maybe our marriage was beyond repair. Yet, something deep inside me yearned for closure, or perhaps a renewed bond. The therapist suggested we try couples counseling. When I mentioned it to Charlotte, she agreed instantly, eyes brimming with hope. I remained cautious, unsure, but tentatively committed. We began counseling sessions in a small office with pale green walls. The therapist asked us to communicate openly to discuss what had driven us apart. Charlotte confessed she felt invisible, that I'd become more of a work partner than a spouse. I admitted that I'd grown complacent, perhaps too comfortable, but I refused to accept blame for her affair. That was on her. The sessions were painful, filled with tears and raw confessions. Over time, I realized I still cared about her, but I wasn't sure if love was enough. Trust was the missing link, elusive and fragile, uncertain. Life outside counseling took on a strange rhythm. Sometimes Charlotte would make me breakfast and we'd share a quiet moment at the table. Other times, I'd retreat to my office and close the door, wishing for solitude. My co-workers noticed I was less tense, more focused, but they had no idea the internal battles I was fighting. Each day was a test of patience. Charlotte kept apologizing, kept trying to show me she had changed, but I couldn't shake the image of her kissing Trevor. If I so much as closed my eyes, the memory returned in vivid detail, relentlessly. Months passed, and gradually, we fell into an uneasy peace. We laughed once in a while, usually at silly things like a burnt dinner or a stupid commercial. We started watching old sitcoms together. One evening, she reached for my hand on the couch, and I let her. It felt natural, albeit laden with past ghosts. She spoke of wanting to renew our vows someday, as if that might wipe the slate clean. I told her I wasn't ready. I still woke some nights in a cold sweat, heart pounding with the memory of her betrayal. Healing was slow, tediously. One crisp autumn afternoon, Charlotte invited me for a walk by the river. The leaves were turning gold, the air fresh. As we strolled, she slipped her arm through mine. I was surprised I didn't pull away. She spoke of a future, maybe traveling together, seeing places we'd always dreamed of. I listened quietly, uncertain if I could genuinely share those dreams again. Yet, I felt a stirring of something akin to hope. I found myself telling her about a new business idea I had, how I wanted to expand my operations now that Trevor was gone. She encouraged me, gently. Her support felt genuine, and for the first time, I glimpsed what reconciliation might look like. We had once been a strong team, building a life side by side. Perhaps we could channel that energy again, albeit cautiously. Our counselor praised our progress, reminding us that true forgiveness isn't instantaneous. I wrestled with the question, could I truly forgive her? Some days I believed I could. Other days, I wanted to lock myself away and never let her near my heart again. She sensed my inner battles, often giving me space without complaint. I appreciated that more than she knew. Eventually, Charlotte moved back into our bedroom, though intimacy remained a delicate topic. We'd lie side by side in the darkness, talking quietly about our fears and aspirations. She told me she understood if I couldn't fully trust her yet. I admitted that every time she left the house alone, I felt a pang of anxiety. She didn't dismiss my feelings, she validated them. That mattered. Slowly, we began to rediscover each other. We went on small dates, dinner at our favorite sushi place, a movie matinee. It was tentative, but it felt like a step in the right direction. Genuine. One night, as we cleaned up the dinner plates, she told me she had something to show me. She led me to the living room and handed me a letter. Inside, she'd written a heartfelt account of her guilt, her sorrow, and her wish for a second chance. She said she knew words might not suffice, so she'd also arranged for a marital retreat weekend, a place where couples could bond and heal. I was touched by her initiative. For the first time since she left, I sensed her genuine commitment to rebuilding. I nodded, tears pricking at my eyes. The retreat was held in a rustic lodge surrounded by pine trees. Over 2 days, we participated in workshops about communication, vulnerability, and rebuilding trust. We shared our story with other couples, found out we weren't alone in our struggles. Each exercise forced us to confront truths we'd buried. I saw Charlotte's pain, recognized my own role in the breakdown of our marriage, though it never excused her affair. Still, we found common ground in our desire to move forward. On the final night, a soft rain fell outside, and we stood on the porch, holding hands, hearts trembling. Together, we returned home and continued counseling. Life wasn't magically perfect, but it felt stable. Slowly, that fragile trust grew. One afternoon, I received a phone call from a familiar voice. Trevor. He said he wanted to apologize, that he'd realized his mistakes. My anger flared at the sound of his name, but a surprising calm accompanied it. I told him I had no interest in hearing excuses. He mentioned something about wanting closure. I ended the call, heart pounding. Part of me was proud I hadn't lashed out. Another part felt uneasy, as if old wounds could reopen with a whisper. I told Charlotte about Trevor's call. She went pale, apologized again for her role in the turmoil. I saw her hands tremble, and for once, I placed mine over hers. Maybe we were both learning how to face our demons without running. I didn't care if Trevor found his closure. I only cared about preserving what we were trying to rebuild. That evening, Charlotte and I sat by the fireplace, sipping hot cocoa. We spoke of the future, no longer in wistful abstractions, but in concrete plans, improving the house, maybe adopting a rescue dog. Our conversation felt oddly peaceful, reassuring. Months melted into a year, and though the scar remained, we managed to build something new from the wreckage. It wasn't the carefree love we once had, but it was resilient, shaped by adversity. We celebrated our anniversary quietly, just us two, toasting with champagne in the backyard. I realized that I no longer felt the haunting ache whenever I recalled Trevor's betrayal. Yes, it still hurt sometimes, but the pain had dulled. Charlotte seemed genuinely committed to making this work, and I was discovering that forgiveness could be less a single act and more a lifelong process. Ever evolving. On a winter morning, I found a handwritten letter slipped under our door. It was from Trevor, asking for a chance to talk face to face. I stared at it for a long time, then tore it up. I had no desire to reopen old wounds. Charlotte glanced at me, and I simply shook my head. We were past him, past what he represented. Our relationship wasn't perfect, but it was ours again, built on the lessons we'd learned through pain and regret. Stepping outside, I breathed in the cold air, feeling a strange gratitude. I had chosen to heal, after all.